Welcome to the lecture on how website works. So let's understand what are the components that makes up a website. Well, we have seen the request and response pattern, that is nothing but the client server technology. The client side, basically a browser, someone will initiate the request, someone will type like phptraining.com. The request is sent to the server and server will have some files on it, and once it gets the request, it sends a response back to the browser. And whatever the request is requested for, whatever the resources that they have on the server is requested, will be sent from server to the client. Okay, that's nothing but the client server technologies. So let's understand what are the components sitting behind this phptraining.com on the server. On the phptraining.com server, there is something called as web server. Okay, there are different types of web server. We're going to look into types of the web servers that we have. But understand there is a web server who is listening to this request. Okay, this server is basically saying, okay, this is the request, this is the response, this is the request, this is the response. That's the job of the web server. The web server is always in the listening mode. It is listening for requests, and whatever the request is being sent to him, it will try to execute that. Like if the request is to get a file, then it will execute that command to get the file and send that response via the same web server. And if the request is to execute some language, let's say you have a PHP program, Python program sitting somewhere in the server, and the request is to execute that program, then it will execute that program onto the server, and whatever response comes from that program sent again via the same web server. And your web server typically have database as well. If you're storing the database and you're requesting to fetch the details, then the code that you wrote at your server side will connect to the database, fetch the data, and then it will send back to the web server. Then the web server will send the data back to this client. Okay, similarly, any request that is been done to fetch any of these static files, hypertext files or media files like images, pictures, is again taken care by the web server. So in this context, so web hosting comes in picture when you want to have these details. When you have this web server, you want to have some language support, you want to have database files and everything, you buy this from web hosting. Okay, and if you want to have a domain name, that is phptraining.com, you get it from the domain name providers, that is nothing but the GoDaddy and the Namecheap. The web hosting is provided by the HostGator, Bluehost, DigitalOcean, where you get the server and some of the softwares installed on it. Domain name you buy from GoDaddy and the Namecheap, where they sell the domain name, and then you map the domain name with the IP address. Okay, so let's take an example and I'll show you how these things work in real time. So let's do an example and understand how these things work. So this is a server that is sitting in the internet and I have a public IP address for it. Okay, and on this server I'm running a web server called as Tomcat, Apache Tomcat, and it is in the listening mode. You see it's blinking, it's listening for request. Okay, the server has been started up. Well, this server is in listening mode. It is listening for request, and whenever the request comes, it will serve that request. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a folder. There's a folder called PHP training, and I'm placing an image, I'm placing a video file, then there is something called as an HTML file. Consider this as a file, and what I want to do is I want to fetch these files from the server onto my browser, right? And remember the role of web server. So all the request goes to this web server. This web server will locate the files under its own web apps folder. Okay, it's under Tomcat web apps in the PHP training. So when we try to access, we will provide this name PHP training and we'll say I want to access these files. Then we'll see from the browser how this Tomcat will get the request and send the response to us, and how the HTTP protocol works in the real time. Okay, we have learned about the client server technology, request and response. We talked about HTTP. All these things we're going to see in the real time. And the challenge that we are trying to understand here is the server is having all these files. Okay, how a client could make a request and fetch all these details from the server. Okay, well, this is nothing called as hypertext, the text file, image file, video file, and then we'll try to initiate a request to fetch those details. Okay, so I'm going to minimize this and I'm going to open my browser now. Okay, well, this is the IP address where my Tomcat is running and I have my files, and we have seen the phptraining.com, that is nothing but the folder there, and inside the folder there is a file called index.html. So I'm making a request to my server saying I want to access this index.html file. So when I click enter, so you see the image is been fetched, the video has been fetched. I can play the video, right? I can play the video, means the video is fetched to my client browser, and there is some text that has been displayed onto my browser. Okay, so what is happening in the background, how these things all work together? You are sending a request from your browser to the server, and server has a public IP address. Remember, this has to be accessible from anywhere from the internet, and this is unique. And using this unique IP address, I have a web server running on that server, and on that web server I created a folder called PHP training, and I have some files on it. So I'm trying to say to this server, to the web server, you have a folder called PHP training, can you fetch me this file? And this file actually embeds all those images and videos, and using which it is trying to print those onto my browser. Okay, so let's quickly jump back to our server again. So this is our web server, and we have this dog image. Let me open that up, and then we have this video file. These are called as resources. These are called as the hypertext. Okay, let's go back to our browser. This time we will see HTTP protocol in action. So for that, right click on your browser, go to inspect, or you can say Ctrl+Shift+I. You will come to this window. You can toggle that dock onto your bottom. Then you go to something called as network tab. Okay, so now we will see what is the request that has been sent and what is the response that we're gonna get. Okay, for that you have to refresh the page. So when you refresh the page and when you open up your network tab, you should able to see the files here. Okay, this browser has sent a request to the server, and server has responded with these resources to it. Okay, this is request and response in real time, right? If you open or click any of this, you go to headers, you will see there is a request URL. So you are sending a request to this URL, and there is a response, and response is nothing but your HTML code. That is nothing but some files, okay, text files. And you can see the files here, right? You get the image, you got your video, you got your files, and this all fetched from the server. Let's do one more time refresh. And refresh basically getting all these files, telling you how much seconds it has taken, milliseconds it has taken to fetch those resources from the server. Okay, so this is how a website works, right? A website is hosted onto a server which has an public IP address, and then you create a folder on it, and then you create some files on it, and using a browser you try to access these files, and this file is basically linking up other resources on the server. So once you request this URL, then the server, that is nothing but the Tomcat server, will get the request, and it will respond with all the files that has been requested and send back to the browser. Okay, that's how a website works. So for that website, you see here, I don't have a domain name for it. I can still access my server with the IP address. As I told you, TCP/IP does not require a host name. It works on the IP address. And this is how the HTTP works. This is not TCP/IP protocol. This is an HTTP protocol. So this is an HTTP protocol, hypertext transfer protocol, using which you can send a request to a server and fetch all the hypertext from the server back to your client side. Well, that's all about how a website works, and I'll see you in the next one.